Please be seated. A lot of times in life, we look at things as a series of choices we make. We choose our partner, we choose our friends, we choose our profession, we choose where we're going to live, choose what kind of car we're going to drive, choose if we're going to get up for church this morning or if we're going to try to get a little bit more sleep before everything goes back to normal Monday. And that, for the most part, is a pretty true reality. Life is a series of choices. But sometimes in life, it's not you who makes the choice. Sometimes things are chosen for you, correct? A lot of us just spent an inordinate amount of time with our families. And you don't really choose your family. Your family is chosen for you. You are born into it. A lot of times at work, you will find that you are chosen to do certain projects. And sometimes that's a good thing because you have this sort of skill set and qualifications. A lot of times, though, you're chosen because no one else wants to do it and your boss is giving that task to you, right? So you have to make it happen. So life is a balance between them, right? Sometimes we are the ones who get to make the choice. And sometimes in life, the choice is made for us. And the reason I bring this up someday, this sort of dynamic of choice, is that it's very important to understand our own Christian faith in this sort of balance as well. A lot of times we choose to do things as a Christian. We choose faith and we make decisions to live our lives a certain way in following Jesus. But at the same time, a lot can be said too that Jesus chooses us to do certain things. Jesus chooses us to be his followers. And sometimes God chooses us to do certain things that we may not feel perfectly able or qualified to do. And a great example of this is what we hear coming to the surface, and what are some of the final words from King David that we read in our first reading this morning from the book of 2 Samuel, the 23rd chapter, verses 1 through 7. Now, our first reading this morning comes from the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and it comes from the book of 2 Samuel. And the book of 2 Samuel is a part of a collection of books that biblical scholars like to call the Deuteronomistic history. And the reason they call it the Deuteronomistic history is because, one, it's history, right? The book of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, sort of chronicle the nation of Israel settling in the Promised Land, having this loose sort of tribal government, then becoming a united kingdom under one monarchy, King David, and then that kingdom splitting and both those kingdoms falling and the exile sort of happening. So it's a history of this certain period of the time and the life of the nation of Israel. Now it's called the Deuteronomistic history because the author who put all these oral traditions into writing later on down the road was very much influenced by the theology of the book of Deuteronomy, one of the first 5 books of the Bible. Hence, biblical scholars call it the Deuteronomic history. Now, the book we're reading through specifically in our first reading is 2 Samuel, and a lot of it chronicles the life of King David. And what's happening now is that King David is kind of coming to the end of his reign and his life. And he's reflecting on his time as king and what it needs to be a qualification to be a king. You know, what makes a good king? And for David, he says that really being a good king is 2 things: being just and honoring God. If you do those 2 things, your reign will be like the sun's effect on creation. It will give life, it will be flourishing. All the benefits we get from the sun, justice and honoring God as a king, will give those benefits to your kingdom. And then he asks a sort of kind of weird rhetorical question. He says, "Is not my house like this with God?" And the thing about that is it's kind of ironic that David is asking this. And he knows that, and I think that's why David is saying this in his final words. Because if anyone really studies King David's life, they will know that justice and honoring God were not really always a part of King David's life, in fact. In fact, right before all this is happening in the book of 2 Samuel, we see David and his whole kingdom almost come unraveled as David makes a series of choices that neither honor God nor are just and fair for his kingdom. King David decides to have an affair with another man's wife. And when she becomes pregnant, he sends that man off to fight on the front lines of his war, so he's killed, so he can marry that woman. Then one of his sons rapes his half-sister. And instead of doing anything about it, King David just ignores it, doesn't address the problem at all. And so Tamar's half-brother gets mad and starts a revolt and starts to unseat his father, and it leads the whole kingdom into mass chaos, spiraling out of control. So David's family's problems become the nation's problems, and everything is unhinged. And finally, David does gather the kingdom back together, but not without having to kill his own son and go through all this sort of turmoil. So was David a just ruler? Was he a ruler that honored God? Yes and no. But what David's talking about, when he's talking about covenant and all this other stuff in the song, is God chose him knowing that he was an imperfect person to be a king. And even though he did and made some horrible mistakes, through him, God was able to do a lot of good. And God was able to bring the nation of Israel from a loose grouping of tribes into a nation where justice and peace and serving God was the top priority. And I think this is a really important point, because it's something that we often kind of get lost in, and that gets maybe thought of in our world today about the Christian faith. And that is, God didn't choose you to be his follower because you were perfect. In fact, if you read the Bible, God likes to use normal people to do his work on earth. People with flaws, people who make mistakes, people whose lives are not neat and orderly, right? God doesn't choose the most perfect, the most, best people in the world to be his followers. He chooses you, he chooses me, knowing full well that we're not perfect. And King David is holding this up and saying, it's not because I was qualified to be the king that God chose me. God chose me simply because God wanted me to do this job. And it was with God's blessing and with God's power and grace behind me that I was able to be the king. So I think that's an important dynamic that we should really look and examine in our own lives of faith. A lot of times we think of these as a series, we make choices in our faith. But also, remember that God did choose you as well to be your follower. God called you into being his follower. Knowing who you are, knowing that you're not perfect, and being very capable of that, and very comfortable with that, but still is going to do a lot of good through you. This is something that always comes very close to my mind whenever I go home, right? Because now I'm a minister, and I go home to people I grew up with. And a lot of my early life was not the conduct of a normal minister, or what people expect of a minister. So sometimes people see me like, oh, Brian, what are you doing now? They go, oh, I'm an Episcopal priest. Like, oh, how'd that play out? But anyway, but that's the dynamic, though. God called me into this role not because I'm perfect, not because I'm going to be a great priest or I'm the perfect priest, but because this is what God wants me to do. And that's the way God works. And that's what we see in the life of the King David. And that's what we see in our own lives as well. It's not because we're perfect. It's not because we're the best people in the world. God calls us because God calls us. So as we look and reflect on life, let's not just look at, especially our Christian life, as the choices we make. Let us always remember on this Sunday as we reflect on this reading that God also chose us. Not because we're perfect, not because we're special, but because God wanted to choose us. And that when God chooses us, God will give us His Spirit, His grace, and will be with us through this journey to do the good works that God has given us to do. Because the way God works, as we see in the story of King David, it's not by big sweeping changes that the kingdom comes about. It's by the little itty-bitty good things that each one of us does that becomes a tiny part of this intricate puzzle that's leading to God's beautiful plan of justice and peace and love for our earth. And all of us have been chosen to be an integral and important part of God's beautiful and wonderful plan. Amen.
Amen.